Chapter 25. Violet attended Stella's service, standing quietly at the back as the small gathering paid their respects. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. Public displays of emotion had no place in her tightly controlled psyche. She had spent years perfecting the art of keeping her feelings in check, compartmentalizing grief into neat, orderly spaces where it couldn't disrupt her focus. After the service, Violet returned to her work, her outward demeanor unchanged, but inside, a familiar unease churned. The open-source project she'd worked so hard to launch had taken on a life of its own, and for the first time, she felt its weight as a responsibility rather than an accomplishment. Stella's death was a stark reminder that code wasn't neutral, that even the best intentions could pave the way for unintended consequences. Alice sat in her kitchen staring at her coffee mug as the steam curled into the air. The silence in the house was deafening, punctuated only by the occasional creak of the floorboards. She'd done what she thought was right, publishing a frank, unvarnished account of the drones, the dangers of unchecked open-source AI, and the decisions that had led to Stella's death. She'd laid it all bare, from the initial enthusiasm to the oversight that turned fatal. The post barely made a ripple. 30 support reactions, no comments of significance, and certainly no visits from regulators or lawyers. Alice had expected a storm, a reckoning. Instead, there was silence. She let out a bitter laugh, the sound echoing in the empty room. When you're a farmer, no one pays attention to your social media posts. Alice pushed the mug aside and opened her laptop. There was no undoing what had happened, no erasing the guilt that lingered in the corners of her mind. But if her words saved even one life, even one more tragedy, then perhaps it was worth it. She glanced at the empty fields outside her window, the wind stirring the dry stalks, and wondered if this was what accountability felt like: heavy, quiet, and unresolved. Garrett had logged into LinkedIn on the long plane ride home. He was one of the people who read Alice's post. He had a gut-wrenching feeling. What had he done? He logged into GitHub to try to unravel what had happened. He was locked out of editing the project. A slow, creeping awareness grew as he dug through the code logs. A rollback of Stella's updates. This hadn't been his decision. He hadn't even been informed. And when he found the changes, when he traced the deletion of safety protocols back to Martin's account, Garrett felt a deep, sinking weight in his chest. The program, the one he'd poured himself into, had been compromised in ways he couldn't ethically ignore. It took him half of the long, sleepless flight and countless cups of bad coffee to decide what to do. Reporting Martin wasn't just about calling out his former manager. It was about stopping something that had spiraled out of control. He knew what it could cost him, his recommendation, maybe even his future in the industry, but he also knew he couldn't stay silent. Garrett filed a report directly with the Department of Agriculture leadership, outlining the changes to the code, the risks they introduced, and the incident with the drones. He included everything: his concerns, his misgivings, and his new belief that AI needed to serve humans responsibly, not recklessly. He detailed how the rollback had led to a lack of control. Garrett felt defeated but also strangely proud. As the plane carried him back to the Midwest, Garrett made a quiet promise to himself. He'd focus on ethical ramifications of AI. This wasn't the end of his journey, just a redirection. The program was shut down within days. Garrett received an email thanking him for his honesty and reminding him of his non-disclosure agreement. The language was polite but unyielding. He was being told to keep quiet. Martin, meanwhile, sat in his cubicle. The fallout from the report had been swift. His promotion prospects evaporated overnight. The whispers about an office with walls and a door? Gone. The only thing he had left was his cubicle with its small, narrow window. He found himself staring out of it more often than not, the sunlight filtering through and highlighting the fine layer of dust on his desk. The window had always been a consolation prize, a small indicator that he was just a little more important than those without one. Now it felt like a reminder of what he'd lost. His gamble to fast-track the project, to cut corners, had cost him not just his professional reputation, but the chance to build something meaningful. Martin sighed, leaning back in his chair. He could still hear Garrett's voice in his head, cautious and questioning, pointing out the flaws in the system he'd been so eager to overlook. He shook his head, pushing the thoughts aside. Regret wasn't something he allowed himself often, but today it felt unavoidable.